I never thought the day would come when my own daughter-in-law would make me feel invisible in my own family, as if I were nothing more than a servant. Last month, right before her lavish $90,000 wedding ceremony, I made a choice so painful and shocking that it shattered the brittle peace of all our lives. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and at 72 years old, I thought I knew what love looked like. I thought I understood family. I thought the years of sacrifice, the decades of putting everyone else first, the careful dance of keeping peace at any cost. I thought all of that was what mothers were supposed to do. But sitting here now, in my small Queens apartment that finally feels like home again, I realize how wrong I was. Every morning in this cramped space, the creak of the floorboards and the hum of the humidifier were the soundtrack to my exhaustion. I rose before dawn, preparing my husband Robert's tea, Earl Grey with 1 sugar cube, the way he'd demanded for 48 years of marriage. Then I'd iron my son Michael's shirts, even though he was 35 and perfectly capable of doing it himself. After that, I'd clean the house that smelled faintly of jasmine-scented candles, his young wife Stephanie's brand of masking what I call neglect. The morning light filtering through the thin curtains always felt harsh against my tired eyes. I wrapped my hands around the worn edges of the kitchen counter, trying to steady myself when my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a group chat from family. My heart always jumped when I saw those notifications, hoping for an invitation, a warm message, maybe a simple, "How are you, Mom?" Instead, the words that appeared made my hands shake. "Really sorry, Nana, but we can't have you at the ceremony. It's an intimate affair." That text sliced sharper than any knife I'd ever used in that kitchen. I read it 3 times, 4 times, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Intimate affair? This was a wedding that cost more than most people's annual salaries. This was a celebration they'd been planning for 2 years, talking about constantly, asking me to contribute money toward. Money I scraped together from my part-time shifts at the neighborhood clinic. I stared at the faded photograph of my son and me that I kept beside the coffee maker. In it, he was 7 years old, chasing pigeons in Central Park while I held his hand, smiling like I owned the whole world. That photo reminded me of promises made and dreams shared, now crumbling like the sticky brown sugar cookies I baked every holiday, cookies that sat untouched on my kitchen counter while everyone rushed off to more important things. The weight of that moment pressed down on my chest like a heavy blanket. I sat down at my small dining table, the same table where I'd helped Michael with his homework, where I'd taught him to play cards, where I'd listened to his teenage heartbreaks and celebrated his college graduation. Now it felt like a monument to everything I'd lost without even realizing it was slipping away. But this story, my story, it didn't start with that text message. It started years ago, with the slow accumulation of small betrayals, tiny cuts that eventually bled me dry. I need you to understand how I got to that breaking point, because maybe you'll recognize pieces of your own story in mine. I remember the years piling up like worn bills in my purse. Each dollar given, each sacrifice made, each time I said yes when I wanted to say no. The money I sent from my part-time nursing shifts when Michael's consulting business faltered during the recession. Thousands of dollars from my modest savings account. Money I'd put aside for my own security. For the medical bills that were already starting to pile up. For the retirement I wasn't sure I could afford. "Mom, could you help us out? Just until we get back on our feet," Michael had asked, his voice carrying that familiar tone that made me feel guilty for even hesitating. Stephanie stood beside him in their Manhattan apartment, the one they couldn't really afford but insisted on keeping because of the address. Her arms crossed, her expression suggesting this conversation was beneath her dignity. I wrote check after check, transferred money through apps I barely understood, watched my bank balance dwindle while telling myself this was temporary. This was what mothers did. This was love in action. But temporary became permanent, and gratitude became expectation, and love became something that only flowed in one direction. The nights I sat up by Michael's hospital bed when he had his appendectomy, whispering reassurances no one asked for, bringing him soup and magazines and staying until the nurses practically pushed me out during shift changes. Stephanie was too busy with work to visit more than once, she said. Someone had to be there for him, and that someone was always me. I remember the family disputes I smoothed over with just a little patience. The fights between Michael and Robert about money and responsibility and the future. I became the translator, the mediator, the one who absorbed everyone's anger and frustration and somehow transformed it into something manageable. I swallowed my own opinions, my own hurt feelings, my own exhaustion, because keeping the peace seemed more important than keeping my sanity. "Mom, can you please drop the groceries off? I'm busy with the caterer," Michael said one Tuesday afternoon last spring, barely looking up from his phone. I had just finished an 8-hour shift at the clinic, my feet aching in shoes that needed replacing 2 years ago, but I drove the 40 minutes to their apartment building with bags of organic produce and imported olive oil that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. The way his eyes darted away when he spoke to me, that look became familiar. It felt like a silent verdict. You are here to serve, not to belong. You are useful when we need something, invisible when we don't. The elevator ride up to their 15th floor always made me nervous, not because of the height, but because I never knew what version of my family I'd encounter. Would they be distracted and dismissive? Would they need something else before I could leave? Would they even say thank you? The silences at family dinners grew thick, filled with unspoken resentments and clipped tones. Stephanie would discuss her work, something in digital marketing that apparently required constant travel to exciting cities, while I cleared plates and refilled water glasses. Michael talked about his networking events, his potential partnerships, his 5-year plan that always seemed to depend on other people's money. Robert nodded along, proud of his son's ambition, while I wondered when I'd become the hired help in my own family. I began to wonder, was I a grandmother? Or just the housekeeper with a fading smile? When had my opinions stopped mattering? When had my presence become something they tolerated rather than welcomed? These questions kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling of my bedroom, listening to Robert's steady breathing and feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. The birthdays that passed unnoticed should have been my first real warning. My 70th came and went with a Facebook message from Michael, not even a phone call, and a gift card to a restaurant I'd never been to in a neighborhood I couldn't afford. Stephanie didn't acknowledge it at all. The grandchildren I'd been so excited about, Michael's stepchildren from Stephanie's previous marriage, barely knew my name, let alone when I was born. My arthritis pain was dismissed as the natural aches of aging, even when I could barely open jars or climb stairs. "Everyone gets old, Mom," Michael said when I mentioned struggling with the grocery bags. "Maybe it's time to accept that you can't do everything you used to do." But somehow I was still expected to do everything I'd always done for them, and more. The morning my world truly cracked open started like any other. The smell of burnt coffee led me to the kitchen, where I discovered Robert had left the pot on all night again. His memory was starting to slip, though neither of us wanted to acknowledge it out loud. I was cleaning up the mess when my phone rang. Stephanie, which was unusual. She never called unless she needed something. "Margaret, I need you to be completely honest with me," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was about to be unreasonable but wanted to sound rational. "Are you upset about not being included in the inner circle of the wedding planning?" Inner circle. As if my own son's wedding was a corporate board meeting where I needed special clearance to participate. "I just thought," I began, but she cut me off, "because we really need this to be perfect. And we can't have any drama or negativity affecting the day. You understand, right? It's not personal. Not personal. My son's wedding, the son I'd carried for 9 months, raised for 18 years, supported through college and career changes and relationship failures. His wedding was not personal." I hung up without saying goodbye, something I'd never done in my life. That afternoon, driven by a suspicion I couldn't shake, I made a decision that would haunt me for weeks. I drove to their apartment building, used the key they'd given me for emergencies, and let myself into their empty home. I told myself I was just checking to make sure everything was secure, but really I was looking for answers to questions I was afraid to ask. I found them in Stephanie's walk-in closet, tucked between shoeboxes, wedding invitation samples, guest lists, venue contracts. My hands trembled as I read through them, each page confirming what I'd begun to suspect. This wasn't a small, intimate ceremony. This was a grand celebration for 200 guests at one of Manhattan's most exclusive venues. There were invitations for distant cousins I'd met once, college friends who lived across the country, business associates whose names I didn't recognize. My name appeared nowhere. Not in the guest list, not in the family section, not in the +1 category. I was erased from my own son's wedding as completely as if I'd never existed. The woman who'd raised him, who'd sacrificed for his education, who'd bailed him out financially more times than I could count, I was less important to his special day than his college roommate's girlfriend. I sank onto the bedroom floor, surrounded by evidence of my own irrelevance, and felt something inside me crack. Not break, not yet, but crack, like ice under too much weight. The tears came then, silent and hot, pooling on the expensive hardwood floors of the home I'd helped them buy. But it was what I found next that shattered me completely. At the bottom of a manila folder, I discovered a printed email chain between Michael and Stephanie from 3 months earlier. The subject line read, "Mom problem. She's going to want to be involved in everything," Stephanie had written. "And honestly, she's just going to bring the whole vibe down. You know how she gets. All emotional and clingy. This day needs to be about us, about our future, not about managing her feelings." Michael's response was a knife through whatever was left of my heart. "You're right. It's easier if we just don't tell her the details. She'll understand eventually. She always does." I held those pages until they crumpled in my shaking hands. This wasn't a misunderstanding or poor communication. This wasn't about keeping costs down or limiting numbers for practical reasons. This was deliberate. This was calculated. They had actively plotted to exclude me from one of the most important days of my son's life. I drove home in a daze, running a red light and nearly missing my exit, my mind unable to process what I'd learned. At home, I sat at my kitchen table with a chipped teacup full of cold tea, staring at nothing until the cup simply slipped from my numb fingers and shattered on the floor. The sound seemed to echo through the apartment, through my chest, through the careful walls I'd built around my hope and denial. The sharp pieces scattered across the linoleum, and I let them stay there. For the first time in decades, I didn't immediately rush to clean up the mess. I sat there among the broken porcelain and let myself feel everything I'd been pushing down for years. The hurt, the anger, the devastating loneliness of being taken for granted by the people I loved most. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed listening to the sounds of Queens at night, sirens in the distance, the couple upstairs arguing, the radiator clanking with its familiar rhythm. But underneath all of that, I heard something new, a voice in my own head, quiet but insistent, whispering a word I'd never allowed myself to think. No, no, I didn't have to accept this. No, I didn't have to pretend this was normal. No, I didn't have to keep sacrificing my dignity for people who couldn't even pretend to value me. The thought terrified me and thrilled me in equal measure. I was caught between the terrifying loneliness of standing alone and the desperate need for respect I'd never demanded. The next morning, I began the painful process of packing away pieces of my old life. My son's baby blankets, soft and yellow with age, went into a storage box. The family photos that covered every surface of my apartment, birthdays and graduations and holidays where I was always smiling, always in the background. I gathered them up with hands that shook but didn't hesitate. I stared into the bathroom mirror, tracing the lines carved by years of invisible wounds, years of swallowing disappointment and calling it love. Who was I if not the woman everyone expected me to be? Who was I if I stopped saying yes to every request, stopped smoothing over every conflict, stopped making myself smaller so everyone else could feel bigger? I didn't know, but I was about to find out. The confrontation I'd been dreading came 2 days later. Michael arrived unannounced, something that used to make me drop everything and rush to make him comfortable. This time I remained seated at my kitchen table, still in my bathrobe at 2 in the afternoon, surrounded by photo albums and memory boxes. "Mom, what's all this?" he asked, gesturing at the chaos I'd created while sorting through 40 years of family history. "I'm organizing," I said simply, not looking up from the photo in my hands. his high school graduation, where I stood proud and beaming beside him while he barely tolerated my arm around his shoulders. Stephanie said you went to our apartment without asking. She's pretty upset. This was how it always went. Stephanie's feelings mattered. Stephanie's comfort was the priority. Stephanie's version of events was the truth that needed protecting. I set down the photo and finally looked at my son. Really looked at him. When had he become a stranger? When had his eyes become so cold when they landed on me? I found the wedding invitations, I said. The color drained from his face. Mom, I can explain. Can you? I stood up, my back straighter than it had been in years. Can you explain why your coworkers' wives are invited but your mother isn't? Can you explain why you discussed me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved? His denial was immediate and predictable. You're being dramatic. We never said we didn't want you there. We just thought you'd be more comfortable. Stop. The word came out harder than I intended, cutting through his rehearsed explanation like a blade. Just stop lying. I read the emails, Michael. I saw exactly what you think of me. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched my adult son struggle to find words that would somehow make this acceptable. Some explanation that would put the responsibility back on me for misunderstanding, for being too sensitive, for expecting too much. You don't understand the pressure we're under, he finally said. This wedding is important for Stephanie's career, for our future. There are investors coming, potential clients. We need everything to be perfect. And I would ruin that perfection, is that it? He couldn't meet my eyes. It's not about you ruining anything. It's about priorities. Priorities. There it was. The truth wrapped in a word that was supposed to sound reasonable. I had raised this man, sacrificed my own dreams so he could chase his, emptied my bank account to fund his ambitions, and now I was learning exactly where I ranked in his priorities. Somewhere below business contacts and networking opportunities, and the approval of a woman who had never shown me a moment of genuine warmth. What do you want from me, Mom? The question came out tired and frustrated, as if my hurt feelings were an unreasonable burden he shouldn't have to carry. I want you to see me, I said quietly. I want you to remember that I'm not just a resource you can use when convenient. I'm your mother. I loved you before anyone else in this world even knew you existed. But even as I spoke the words, I could see they weren't landing. His phone buzzed and his eyes dropped to the screen automatically, a Pavlovian response that told me everything about what had his attention. I wasn't even worth his undivided attention during the conversation about my own exclusion from his wedding. Look, this is getting blown out of proportion, he said, thumbs already moving across his phone screen. Why don't you talk to Dad about this? Maybe he can help you understand. Help me understand. As if the problem was my comprehension rather than his cruelty. As if a reasonable person would naturally accept being erased from their child's most important moments. I realized in that moment that this conversation, like so many others over the years, was never meant to address my concerns. It was meant to exhaust me into compliance. He left without resolution, without apology, without even a promise to reconsider. I sat in the silence he left behind, surrounded by the scattered evidence of a relationship that had been dying so slowly I hadn't noticed it was already gone. That evening, something unexpected happened. A knock on my door revealed Mrs. Elena Alvarez, my elderly neighbor from 2 apartments down. We'd exchanged pleasantries in the hallway for years, but she'd never visited my home before. "Forgive me for bothering you," she said in her gentle voice, slightly accented from her childhood in Puerto Rico. "But I couldn't help noticing you seemed troubled lately. I brought empanadas." The kindness in her eyes, genuine, uncomplicated kindness with no agenda behind it, brought tears I'd been holding back all day. She stepped into my apartment, took one look at the chaos of photos and boxes, and without a word, began helping me make tea. "Family troubles?" she asked, setting delicate china cups on my table with the practiced grace of someone who understood the healing power of ritual. I found myself telling her everything. The wedding, the exclusion, the emails, the years of feeling invisible in my own family. She listened without judgment, without trying to fix or explain or minimize what I was feeling. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You know," she said finally, "I raised 5 children, sacrificed everything for them, just like you did. And I learned something the hard way. Sometimes the people we love most are the ones who take us for granted most completely. They know we'll always be there, so they stop seeing us. But what am I supposed to do? They're my family. They're all I have. Are they? Her question was gentle but probing. Or have you made yourself so available, so accommodating, that you forgot you're a person with your own worth, your own needs, your own right to be treated with respect? That night, I couldn't sleep again. But this time, it wasn't from heartbreak. It was from possibility. Mrs. Alvarez had planted a seed I couldn't ignore. What if I stopped making myself so available? What if I stopped accommodating everyone else's comfort at the expense of my own dignity? What if I said no? The idea frightened me more than I wanted to admit. For so many years, my identity had been built around being needed, being useful, being the one who solved problems and smoothed over conflicts and never, ever caused trouble. Who would I be if I wasn't that person? What would be left of me? But lying in my bed in the pre-dawn darkness, I began to imagine something I'd never allowed myself to picture before. A life where I mattered, where my presence was wanted, not just tolerated, where I could speak my mind without immediately apologizing for having opinions, where I could say no without feeling guilty, yes without feeling used, and nothing at all without the silence being filled with expectations. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It started small, with tiny acts of rebellion that felt enormous to me. When Robert asked me to iron his shirts the next morning, I said, "You can do that yourself." When Michael called asking me to pick up dry cleaning for their engagement party, another event I wasn't invited to, I said, "I'm busy that day." These might sound like small things to you, but they were revolutionary for me. Each no felt like learning a new language, like exercising muscles that had been dormant for decades. The guilt was overwhelming at first. I'd been programmed to believe that my value came from service, that love was earned through sacrifice, that good mothers never put themselves first. But slowly, something inside me began to shift. The guilt was still there, but underneath it, I found something I'd forgotten existed: self-respect. And once I remembered what that felt like, I couldn't go back to pretending I didn't deserve it. The wedding was still 3 weeks away when I made my decision. I wasn't going to fight for an invitation I should never have had to ask for. I wasn't going to beg my own son to include me in his celebration. Instead, I was going to do something that would change everything. I called the bank where I'd kept my savings account for 20 years and made an appointment with a financial advisor. It was time to stop funding other people's dreams while neglecting my own security. The stock portfolio Michael had convinced me to let him manage, money that had somehow become family investments rather than my personal retirement fund. I was taking back control of every dollar. The meeting at the bank was eye-opening. Apparently, my modest investments had grown significantly over the years. What had started as a small nest egg had become a substantial sum, worth more than I'd realized. The advisor, a kind woman named Patricia who reminded me of myself at 50, helped me understand that I had options I'd never considered. "You don't have to live paycheck to paycheck," Patricia explained, showing me spreadsheets that revealed my actual financial position. "With proper planning, you could be quite comfortable. You could travel, pursue hobbies, even relocate if you wanted a fresh start." A fresh start. The phrase echoed in my mind for days afterward. I began to research things I'd only dreamed about: art classes, senior travel groups, volunteer opportunities that would give me purpose beyond serving my ungrateful family. For the first time in years, I felt excited about the future instead of resigned to it. But the real test came when Michael called, panic clear in his voice. The caterer needed final payment, he said. The venue required additional insurance deposits. Various wedding expenses had piled up beyond their budget, and they needed help covering the costs. "I know we can count on you, Mom," he said, using the wheedling tone that had always worked in the past. "It's just until after the wedding, and then we'll pay you back with interest." In the old days, I would have already been reaching for my checkbook. I would have transferred money before he finished explaining what he needed. I would have felt proud to contribute to his happiness, honored to be trusted with his financial emergency. Instead, I said, "No." The silence stretched so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean, I won't be giving you money for a wedding I'm not invited to." Mom, that's not. We talked about this. It's not personal. And this is different. This is just a loan. Everything is personal, Michael. Your wedding is personal. Your decision to exclude me is personal. And my decision to keep my money is personal too. I could hear him texting while we talked, probably messaging Stephanie, probably strategizing about how to handle this unexpected obstacle. The sound of those keyboard clicks, evidence that I wasn't even worth his undivided attention during our conversation, strengthened my resolve. Mom, be reasonable. We're family. Family helps each other. You're absolutely right, I said. Families do help each other. They include each other in important moments. They consider each other's feelings. They show gratitude and respect. So when you start treating me like family, I'll consider acting like it too. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking not from fear, but from adrenaline. I had never spoken to my son that way in his entire life. I had never set a boundary so clearly or held my ground so firmly. It felt terrifying and exhilarating and completely foreign. The phone rang again immediately. Then again. Text messages started pouring in, from Michael, from Stephanie, even from Robert, who rarely got involved in family drama, but had apparently been recruited for emotional manipulation duty. Your son is heartbroken, Robert texted. This isn't like you. Please reconsider. But that was exactly the problem. It wasn't like me. The old me would have already called Michael back with apologies and promises. The old me would have convinced herself that keeping the peace was more important than keeping my dignity. The old me would have written another check and told herself that love required sacrifice, even when the sacrifice was only flowing in one direction. The new me, this person I was slowly becoming, had different priorities. I spent the next few days in a strange state of suspension, waiting for the emotional manipulation I knew was coming. It arrived in waves, each family member playing their assigned role in the campaign to return me to compliance. Michael tried the guilt approach first. Long voicemails about how hurt he was by my selfishness, how disappointed he was that I would choose money over his happiness, how he'd always thought he could count on me but apparently he was wrong. Stephanie took a different tactic. Cold professionalism. A formal email explaining that they'd found alternative funding for the wedding, thank you very much, and hoped I was satisfied with the outcome. The subtext was clear. They didn't need me, and now I'd be excluded from even more family events as punishment for my defiance. Robert was recruited for the nuclear option, emotional blackmail wrapped in concern for my well-being. I'm worried about you, Margaret, he said over dinner, his voice heavy with manufactured concern. This isn't like you. You've always been so generous, so family-focused. I think you might be going through something. Maybe we should talk to Dr. Henderson about adjusting your medications. The suggestion that my newfound backbone was a symptom of mental illness rather than mental health was the final insult. They couldn't imagine that I might have legitimate grievances. They couldn't conceive that their treatment of me had been anything less than reasonable. In their minds, the problem was my sudden inability to accept the unacceptable with grace and gratitude. But something had fundamentally shifted in me. Each attempt to manipulate me back into line only reinforced my conviction that I'd been right to draw these boundaries. If they were this upset about losing access to my money and services, what did that say about why they'd kept me around in the first place? The wedding was now just 1 week away. I hadn't been contacted about any last-minute changes of heart regarding my invitation. The family group chat had gone quiet, ominously so. I suspected they were planning something, some final dramatic gesture to either bring me back into line or punish me for my rebellion. I was right. It started with a knock on my door at 8 in the morning on a Saturday. Michael stood in my hallway, but he wasn't alone. Stephanie flanked him on one side, Robert on the other. Behind them, I could see the stepchildren, 2 teenagers who barely knew me but had apparently been recruited as witnesses to this family intervention. We need to talk, Michael announced, pushing past me into my apartment without invitation. They arranged themselves in my living room like a tribunal. Stephanie perched on the edge of my sofa as if afraid my furniture might contaminate her designer clothing. The teenagers stayed near the door, clearly uncomfortable, but obedient to whatever script they'd been given. Mom, this has gone far enough, Michael began, his voice carrying the kind of authority he probably used in business meetings. Your behavior lately has been completely unacceptable, and it's affecting the whole family. My behavior? I remained standing, refusing to make myself smaller by sitting while they loomed over me. This whole martyr act, Stephanie interjected, her voice sharp with frustration. Acting like we've done something terrible to you when all we did was try to plan a wedding that would work for everyone. Everyone except me. You're being deliberately obtuse, she continued, warning to her theme. We explained the situation. We kept the numbers small. We prioritized the people who matter most to our future together. The people who matter most. There it was again, the casual cruelty wrapped in reasonable language. I was not among the people who mattered most to my own son's future. I was excess baggage, dead weight, a relic of his past that needed to be managed rather than honored. And now you're trying to sabotage our wedding over hurt feelings, Michael added. Do you realize how selfish that is? How cruel. Selfish. Cruel. These words coming from the man I'd given everything to felt like physical blows. I had sacrificed my own dreams for his education, my own comfort for his security, my own happiness for his success at every turn, and now my refusal to continue that pattern of self-erasure was being characterized as selfishness. What exactly do you want from me? I asked, though I already knew the answer. We want you to stop this tantrum, Stephanie said. We want you to support your son like you always have. We want you to be the mother we know you can be instead of this bitter, vindictive person you've become. The mother they knew I could be. The mother who said yes to everything, who absorbed everyone's problems, who paid for everyone's mistakes, who asked for nothing in return except the privilege of continuing to give. They wanted the old Margaret back, the one who had slowly disappeared over decades of neglect and taken for granted love. What if I said I wanted to come to the wedding? I asked suddenly. The question hung in the air like a challenge. I watched their faces carefully, looking for any sign that this confrontation had made them reconsider their position, any indication that they might actually want me there. Michael and Stephanie exchanged a look, the kind of married couple communication that excludes everyone else in the room. I saw Stephanie's almost imperceptible shake of the head, saw Michael's shoulders tense with resignation. Mom, he said finally, we've been over this. The arrangements are set. The seating is planned. The catering numbers are fixed. It would be incredibly complicated to change everything now. Complicated. That's what including his own mother in his wedding would be. A complication. Not a joy. Not an honor. Not a correction of a terrible mistake. A complication to be avoided. Besides, Stephanie added with false sweetness, I think deep down you know this is for the best. You've been so stressed lately, so emotional. A big event like this might be overwhelming for you. Wouldn't you rather have a nice, quiet day at home instead of dealing with all that chaos? They were rewriting the narrative again, making my exclusion into a favor they were doing me. I was too fragile, too emotional, too old to handle the excitement of their celebration. They were protecting me from myself, these thoughtful children who cared so much about my well-being that they'd rather spare me the burden of witnessing their happiness. I looked around my living room at these people who shared my DNA, but no longer seemed to share my humanity. The teenagers by the door were checking their phones, bored by adult drama they couldn't understand. Robert was staring at his hands, uncomfortable with the confrontation, but clearly on their side. Michael and Stephanie sat expectantly, waiting for me to capitulate as I always had before. Get out, I said quietly. What? Michael blinked as if he'd misheard. Get out of my apartment. All of you. Mom, don't be ridiculous. We're trying to have a conversation here. No, you're trying to manipulate me. You came here to browbeat me into compliance, to make me feel guilty for having boundaries, to convince me that asking for basic respect is somehow unreasonable. My voice was getting stronger with every word. But I'm done with that conversation. I'm done with all of you treating me like a problem to be managed instead of a person to be loved. Stephanie stood up, her composure finally cracking. Fine. We tried to do this the nice way. But since you want to be stubborn, let me be crystal clear. You are not welcome at our wedding. Not now, not ever. And if you think you can emotionally blackmail us into changing our minds, you're wrong. Stephanie, Michael started, but she was on a roll now. No, Michael, she needs to hear this. We're starting a new family, a real family. built on mutual respect and support, not guilt trips and manipulation and constant drama. If she can't be happy for us, if she can't support us without strings attached, then she doesn't deserve to be part of our lives. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at my son, waiting for him to contradict his wife, to defend me, to show some sign that he disagreed with this brutal assessment of my character. Instead, he stood up and took Stephanie's hand. "I think we should go," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Maybe when you've had time to think about what you really want, we can try this conversation again." They filed out of my apartment like a funeral procession, taking with them the last of my illusions about what our relationship actually was. The door closed behind them with a soft click that seemed to echo through my suddenly empty home. I stood in my living room for a long time, surrounded by the scattered remnants of my old life, the photos I'd been sorting, the boxes I'd been packing, the evidence of 40 years of motherhood that had somehow led to this moment of complete rejection. Then I did something I hadn't done in months. I smiled. Not the careful, placating smile I'd perfected for family gatherings. Not the grateful smile I wore when accepting crumbs of attention. A real smile, born from genuine emotion. I was free. For the first time in decades, I was completely, terrifyingly, wonderfully free. The week before the wedding passed in a strange kind of peace. I didn't hear from Michael or Stephanie, which wasn't surprising. Robert moved through the apartment like a ghost, clearly torn between loyalty to his son and some dim awareness that perhaps I hadn't been wrong to stand my ground. I used that time to plan something I'd never allowed myself to consider before, a life that belonged entirely to me. I made an appointment with a travel agent, something I hadn't done since Robert and I were first married. I researched art classes at the community college, volunteer opportunities at the local hospital, book clubs at the library. I was 72 years old, and I was beginning to plan a future for the first time in years. Mrs. Alvarez checked on me daily, bringing coffee and pastries and the kind of uncomplicated friendship I'd forgotten existed. She didn't try to fix my family problems or convince me to reconcile for the sake of peace. She simply saw me, really saw me, and found me worthy of love and attention exactly as I was. "Are you sad about missing the wedding?" she asked one afternoon as we sat on my fire escape, watching the sun set over the Queen's skyline. I considered her question carefully. Was I sad? I was certainly disappointed, certainly hurt by the cruelty of my exclusion. But underneath those feelings was something else. Relief. I wouldn't have to wear an uncomfortable dress and pretend to be happy about being relegated to the least important table. I wouldn't have to smile through speeches that thanked everyone except the woman who'd made their love story possible through her financial support. I wouldn't have to watch my son publicly declare his devotion to building a new family while privately treating his original family like an embarrassment. "I'm sad about what the wedding represents," I said finally. "I'm sad that my relationship with Michael has come to this. But am I sad about missing that particular event? No, I think I might actually be relieved." The day of the wedding arrived gray and drizzly, typical October weather in New York. I woke up later than usual, made myself a proper breakfast for the first time in weeks, and sat at my kitchen table planning my day. I could have wallowed in self-pity, could have spent the day imagining what I was missing. Instead, I decided to celebrate my freedom. I dressed in my favorite outfit, not the formal dress I would have worn to the wedding, but comfortable clothes that made me feel like myself. I took the subway into Manhattan, something I rarely did anymore, and walked through Central Park. The leaves were turning, painting the city in shades of gold and red that took my breath away. I found myself at the boat pond, watching remote-controlled sailboats navigate the choppy water, while their owners, mostly men my age or older, called out instructions and adjustments. There was something beautiful about their intense focus, their childlike joy in these miniature vessels. When had I last felt that kind of uncomplicated pleasure in anything? An elderly man noticed me watching and struck up a conversation. His name was Frank, and he'd been sailing model boats in this pond for 15 years, ever since his retirement from the post office. He told me about the informal club that met here every weekend, about the races they organized, about the satisfaction of building something beautiful and watching it dance across the water. "You should try it sometime," he said. adjusting the rigging on his classic sloop. It's never too late to learn something new. Never too late to learn something new. As I walked home through the golden afternoon light, those words echoed in my mind. I was 72 years old, recently estranged from my son, living on a fixed income in a small apartment in Queens. By most measures, my life was probably closer to its end than its beginning, but for the first time in decades, I felt like it was also just starting. The confrontation I'd been dreading came the next Monday. Not with Michael. I still hadn't heard from him since the wedding, but with the aftermath of choices I'd made without fully considering their consequences. Robert had stayed home from work, something he never did without being seriously ill. I found him at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at his hands with an expression I couldn't read. "How was your weekend?" I asked, though we both knew what I was really asking. "The wedding was beautiful," he said without looking up. Stephanie looked gorgeous. Michael seemed happy. It was everything they wanted it to be. I'm glad, and I found that I actually meant it. I wanted my son to be happy, even if his happiness apparently required my absence. "He asked about you," Robert continued. "Near the end of the reception, asked if you were okay, if you'd said anything about not being there. What did you tell him?" "I told him you were fine, that you'd chosen to spend the day in the city, doing things you enjoyed." Robert finally looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years: respect. I told him that maybe it was time he started thinking about what kind of relationship he wanted with his mother, because the one he had was apparently over. I sat down across from my husband, this man I'd been married to for 48 years, and realized we were having the most honest conversation we'd had in decades. "Are you angry with me?" I asked. "I was," he admitted. "I thought you were being stubborn and dramatic. I thought you should have just endured it, the way you always do." But sitting in that beautiful venue, listening to those speeches about family and love and partnership, watching Michael and Stephanie bask in all that attention and celebration, I kept thinking about you, about how much you sacrificed for that moment to be possible. And I realized that your absence was the loudest thing in that room. We sat in silence for a while, processing 48 years of marriage that had somehow led to this moment of recognition. Finally, Robert reached across the table and took my hand, something he hadn't done in years. "I owe you an apology," he said, "not just for the wedding situation, for letting you become invisible, for taking for granted all the ways you held this family together while I just went along with whatever was easiest, for not standing up for you when you needed me to." The apology I'd never asked for because I'd never believed I deserved one. Coming now, after all these years, it felt both too late and exactly on time. It couldn't undo the damage of decades of neglect, but it could acknowledge that damage had been done. It could validate that my feelings were reasonable, that my boundaries were necessary, that my transformation was justified. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we figure out how to move forward," he said. "Both of us. Together or separately, whatever feels right. But with honesty this time. With respect for what you need, not just what everyone else wants from you." The possibility of rebuilding my marriage at 72 felt daunting and exciting in equal measure. We had years of patterns to unlearn, decades of resentment to address, fundamental assumptions about our roles that needed examination. But for the first time in our long relationship, I felt like I was entering that process as an equal partner, rather than a supporting character in Robert's story. But even as I was cautiously optimistic about my marriage, the situation with Michael continued to deteriorate. The silent treatment stretched into weeks, then months. No phone calls, no text messages, no acknowledgement of my existence. It was as if I had died at the moment I refused to fund their wedding, and now my family was in mourning for the version of me that had never said no. The isolation was harder than I'd expected. I'd prepared myself for guilt, for regret, for the temptation to crawl back and apologize for having boundaries. I hadn't prepared myself for the complete silence, the total erasure of my place in their lives. There were moments, usually late at night when sleep was elusive, when I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake, when I imagined calling Michael and begging forgiveness, promising to return to my old role if he'd just let me back into his life. But then I'd remember the emails I'd found, The casual cruelty of their planning my exclusion, the way they'd discussed me like a problem to be solved. I'd remember the years of sacrifice that had been taken for granted, the way my presence had been tolerated rather than celebrated, the gradual erosion of my dignity in service of keeping peace. And I'd know that as painful as this silence was, it was honest in a way our previous relationship had never been. The holidays were the hardest test. Thanksgiving had always been at our house, with me cooking for days to create the perfect feast for our extended family. This year, I got a text from Michael 3 days beforehand. "We're doing Thanksgiving at Stephanie's parents' house this year. Don't wait up for us. Don't wait up for us." As if I were a babysitter whose services were no longer needed rather than the woman who'd hosted this meal for 30 years. The casual dismissal hurt more than an outright confrontation would have. At least anger acknowledged my existence. This was simply nothing. But instead of spiraling into depression or self-pity, I found myself energized by possibility. If I wasn't cooking Thanksgiving dinner for people who barely tolerated my presence, what could I do with that time and energy instead? The answer came from Mrs. Alvarez, who mentioned that she volunteered every Thanksgiving at a local soup kitchen, serving meals to homeless families and seniors who had nowhere else to go. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was now among the seniors with nowhere else to go for the holiday. But instead of wallowing in that reality, I decided to embrace it. Volunteering at the soup kitchen was a revelation. Here were people facing real hardship, genuine crises, actual emergencies. And here I was, worried about whether my son approved of my boundaries. The perspective was both humbling and liberating. I worked alongside other volunteers, retirees and college students, church groups and corporate teams doing community service. Nobody knew my family drama or my financial situation or my history of people-pleasing. They knew me as Margaret, the woman who was good at organizing serving lines and even better at listening to people who needed to talk. There was something magical about being useful in a context where my service was genuinely appreciated, rather than simply expected. When I handed a plate of turkey and stuffing to a young mother with 2 small children, she looked me in the eye and said, "Thank you so much. This means everything to us." Not because she owed me something or needed something else from me, but because I had provided something she actually needed in that moment. That afternoon, serving meals to people who were genuinely grateful for help, I felt more valuable and appreciated than I had in years of serving my ungrateful family. It was a powerful reminder that the problem hadn't been with my desire to serve others. It had been with the people I'd chosen to serve. Christmas approached with the same silence from Michael's family. No invitation, no acknowledgement, no recognition that I might have feelings about being excluded from yet another family celebration. But this time, I was prepared. I made plans, real plans, for myself, that had nothing to do with accommodating anyone else's schedule or preferences. I booked a week-long stay at a bed and breakfast in the Hudson Valley, something I'd always wanted to do but never allowed myself. I researched winter hiking trails, local museums, cozy restaurants where I could have dinner alone without feeling conspicuous or pitied. The week before Christmas, as I was researching activities for my solo vacation, my phone rang. Michael's name on the screen made my heart race with hope and dread in equal measure. I let it ring 4 times before answering, preparing myself for anything from an apology to another confrontation. "Mom." His voice was strained, uncertain. "How are you?" "I'm well, thank you. How are you?" We're good. Great, actually. Things are really coming together for us." A pause. "Listen, I was wondering if we could talk. Maybe get together for coffee or something." The casual tone, as if months of silence were normal, as if his total rejection of my boundaries hadn't happened, made me cautious. "What did you want to talk about?" "Just family stuff. I miss talking to you, Mom. I miss our relationship." He missed our relationship. I wondered which part of it he missed specifically. The money, the errands, the emotional labor, or the convenient scapegoat when anything went wrong. I doubted he missed the person I'd become, the one who said no and asked for respect and refused to disappear on command. "I'm actually leaving town tomorrow for Christmas week," I said. "Perhaps we could talk when I get back." "You're traveling? By yourself?" The surprise in his voice was almost insulting, as if the idea that I might have a life outside of serving his needs was incomprehensible. Yes, I'm taking a vacation. Something I've been looking forward to for months. Oh, okay. Well, maybe we could do something for New Year's? A family dinner or something? A family dinner. After missing Thanksgiving, after being excluded from Christmas, he was casually suggesting we could all get together for another holiday meal when it was convenient for him. The audacity was breathtaking. We'll see, I said noncommittally. Enjoy your Christmas, Michael. I hung up before he could respond, but not before I heard the frustration in his voice at my lack of immediate enthusiasm for his crumbs of attention. The old Margaret would have canceled her vacation, would have rushed to accommodate his sudden interest in spending time together, would have been grateful for any acknowledgement at all. The new Margaret packed her suitcase and looked forward to a week of snow-covered mountains and cozy fireplaces, and absolutely no family drama. The bed and breakfast was everything I'd hoped for and more. A converted Victorian mansion in Cold Spring, overlooking the Hudson River, with rooms that smelled like cedar and pine, and breakfast served on actual china with cloth napkins. My room had a fireplace and a view of the water, and for the first time in years, I woke up each morning with genuine excitement about how I'd spend my day. I hiked through snow-dusted forests, visited art galleries in tiny historic towns, took a painting class at a local community center. I ate restaurant meals alone without apologizing to servers for taking up a table, read books by the fire without interruption, took long baths in the deep clawfoot tub without someone needing something from me every 10 minutes. On Christmas Eve, I attended midnight service at a small Episcopal church that looked like something from a Christmas card. I sat in a pew surrounded by strangers who welcomed me warmly, singing carols I'd known since childhood, listening to readings about hope and redemption and new beginnings. When the minister spoke about the courage required to step into an unknown future, trusting that love would guide us even when the path was unclear, I felt like she was speaking directly to me. That night, alone in my room with snow falling outside my window, I realized I wasn't lonely. I was solitary, which was entirely different. Loneliness was what I'd felt for years, surrounded by family members who tolerated my presence without truly seeing me. Solitude was this: peaceful, chosen, filled with possibility rather than obligation. I returned from my vacation refreshed and clear-headed, ready to face whatever came next. What came next was a surprise I should have anticipated, but somehow didn't see coming. Robert was waiting for me with news that would shift our family dynamics yet again. Michael and Stephanie were getting divorced. The marriage that had been so important, so worthy of my exclusion and sacrifice, had lasted less than 6 months. What happened? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Money problems, according to Michael. Stephanie's spending got out of control. She ran up massive credit card debt planning the wedding and then kept spending afterward. Designer clothes, expensive restaurants, a new car she couldn't afford. Michael said he tried to talk to her about budgeting, about living within their means, but she accused him of being controlling. The irony was sharp enough to cut. The woman who'd characterized my reasonable desire to be included as selfish manipulation was apparently genuinely selfish and manipulative. The man who'd accused me of emotional blackmail had married someone who wrote the handbook on it. "He's been trying to reach you," Robert continued. "Says he needs to talk to you about something important." I could guess what that something was. Michael's expensive divorce, his soon-to-be ex-wife's debts, his need for financial and emotional support during this difficult time. He would want to rebuild our relationship now that his marriage had crashed and burned, now that he needed me again. The timing was suspiciously convenient, but I wasn't the same woman who'd always been available for his crises. I wasn't the mother who dropped everything to rush to his rescue, who emptied my bank account to solve his problems, who absorbed his emotional turmoil and somehow transformed it into peace. That woman had died the day I decided my own dignity was worth protecting. When he called, I answered calmly. "Hello, Michael. Mom, I'm so glad you answered. I really need to talk to you. Could you come over? Or I could come there. Whatever's easier for you. Whatever's easier for you." A small acknowledgement that perhaps my convenience mattered, that maybe I had a right to preferences about how and when we spoke. It was a tiny shift, but I noticed it. "We can talk on the phone," I said. "Some things are better discussed in person. It's complicated, Mom. And I could really use your advice. Your support. Your support. There it was. The thing he'd never valued until he needed it. The thing he'd taken for granted until it was withdrawn. Now that his marriage was falling apart. Now that his financial situation was uncertain. Now that his carefully planned future was crumbling. Suddenly he remembered that he had a mother who might have wisdom and resources to offer. I heard about the divorce, I said simply. From Dad, I guess. Yeah, it's been really difficult. Stephanie, she's not who I thought she was. She's been lying about money, hiding expenses, running up debt behind my back. I feel like such an idiot for not seeing it sooner. I bit back the observation that I'd seen it quite clearly, that his wife's casual cruelty toward me had been a preview of how she'd treat him once she felt secure in the relationship. There was no satisfaction in being right about something that had caused him pain. I'm sorry you're going through this. The thing is, Mom, I'm going to need help. Financial help, I mean. The divorce is going to be expensive, and I'm liable for half her debt. And I don't know how I'm going to manage all of this on my own. And there it was. The real reason for the renewed interest in our relationship. The sudden desire to repair what he'd broken. Not because he'd realized I deserved better treatment. Not because he'd gained new appreciation for everything I'd sacrificed for him over the years. But because he needed money, and I was the most likely source. The silence stretched between us while I processed the magnitude of his audacity. For months I'd been dead to him. My boundaries had been unacceptable, my need for respect unreasonable, my hurt feelings dramatic and manipulative. But now that he was in crisis, all of that was forgotten. Now I was supposed to rush to his aid as if nothing had happened, as if our relationship hadn't been fundamentally altered by his choices. Michael, I said carefully, do you remember our last conversation? Do you remember what you said to me? Mom, I know things got heated. I know we both said things we didn't mean, but that's in the past now. This is about moving forward, about being there for each other when it counts. Things we didn't mean. As if his deliberate exclusion of me from his wedding had been some kind of misunderstanding, some unfortunate miscommunication that could be smoothed over with enough time and necessity. As if Stephanie's declaration that I wasn't worthy of inclusion in their real family had been taken out of context. Actually, I said, I meant everything I said. And I think you did too. That's not… Mom, come on. We're family. Family forgives each other. Family moves on from these kinds of disagreements. Family. The word he'd weaponized to manipulate me for years. Used to justify taking my money and ignoring my needs and dismissing my feelings. Now it was supposed to magically repair the damage he'd done. Supposed to erase months of silence and cruelty because he needed something from me. You're right that family forgives each other, I agreed. And family moves on from disagreements. But first, there has to be acknowledgement of what went wrong. There has to be genuine remorse for the harm that was caused. There has to be some indication that things will be different going forward. Of course, I'm sorry. I'm sorry things went the way they did. I'm sorry you were hurt. Sorry I was hurt. Not sorry for hurting me. Not sorry for the choices he'd made. Not sorry for treating me like a disposable resource. Sorry that I'd had feelings about being treated badly as if my emotional response were the real problem rather than his actions. That's not quite the same thing, I said. What do you want me to say, Mom? What do you want me to do? I need your help right now. I need you to be my mother. I need you to be my mother. The phrase hung in the air between us, loaded with assumptions about what mothers were supposed to do, and when, and for whom. He needed me to be the version of his mother who'd never said no, never set boundaries, never prioritized her own well-being over his comfort. He needed the mother who'd been slowly disappearing over decades of neglect, who'd finally died the day I refused to fund a wedding I wasn't invited to. I am your mother, I said quietly. I've been your mother every day of your life, even when you decided I wasn't worthy of inclusion in your most important moments. But being your mother doesn't mean being your personal ATM or your emergency emotional support system that you can ignore until you need something. That's not… I don't think of you that way. Don't you? When was the last time you called just to see how I was doing? When was the last time you asked about my health, my interests, my life? When was the last time you treated me like a person whose feelings and opinions mattered, rather than a resource to be managed? The silence that followed was answer enough. He couldn't remember, because it had never happened. Our entire relationship had been built around my service to his needs, my accommodation of his preferences, my willingness to disappear whenever my presence was inconvenient. Things can be different, he said finally. This whole situation, this divorce, it's made me realize what's really important. Family is important. You're important. I'm important. Now that his marriage had failed, now that his financial situation was precarious, now that he was facing consequences for choosing poorly, suddenly, I was important. The timing was suspicious, to say the least. I appreciate you saying that, I said, and I hope you mean it. But words are easy, Michael. If you want to rebuild our relationship, it's going to require more than just saying the right things when you need something from me. What do you mean? I mean, you're going to have to show me that I matter to you when you don't need anything from me. You're going to have to demonstrate that you value my presence, not just my resources. You're going to have to prove that the changes you're talking about are real and permanent, not just temporary adjustments to get through your current crisis. But I need help now. I can't wait months or years to prove myself while my whole life falls apart. And there was the truth, finally spoken plainly. He needed help now, and proving that he'd actually changed would be inconvenient timing. Better to skip the accountability phase and move straight to the rescue, with promises of improved behavior sometime in the future when things were less urgent. Your life isn't falling apart, I said. Your marriage is ending, which is difficult, but not catastrophic. You're facing some financial challenges, but you're a capable adult with a good career and transferable skills. You have options that don't involve asking your previously estranged mother to bail you out of problems created by the same poor judgment that led to our estrangement in the first place. The words felt foreign in my mouth, this direct confrontation of the narrative he was trying to create. In his version of events, he was a victim of circumstances beyond his control, deserving of sympathy and support from the family he'd rejected when times were good. In my version, he was experiencing natural consequences of his choices and looking for someone else to absorb the cost of his mistakes. I can't believe you're doing this to me, he said, his voice rising with frustration. I'm going through the worst time of my life, and my own mother is punishing me for what? For having a wedding you didn't approve of? For having a wedding I wasn't invited to, I wanted to correct, but I could see there was no point. He genuinely couldn't understand the difference between host approval and basic inclusion, between supporting decisions and being treated with fundamental respect. To him, my exclusion had been a reasonable accommodation to complex logistics, and my hurt feelings were an overreaction that should be easily dismissed now that he needed something from me. I'm not punishing you, I said. I'm protecting myself. There's a difference. Protecting yourself from what? From helping your own son. Protecting myself from being used, from being taken for granted, from pouring energy into a relationship where I'm only valued when I'm useful. That's not true. That's not how I see you. Then show me, I said. Show me how you see me, not by asking for money or emotional labor or crisis management, but by treating me like someone whose company you enjoy, whose opinions you respect, whose presence in your life is a gift rather than a given. The conversation ended without resolution, which felt appropriate. Resolution would require changes in behavior over time, not just the right combination of words in a single phone call. Michael hung up frustrated and probably angry, convinced that I was being unreasonable and cruel when he needed support most. I hung up sad but clear, knowing that I'd spoken my truth even when it was difficult to hear. The months that followed brought a strange kind of peace. Michael's divorce proceeded messily and expensively, as divorces often do when there are significant assets and debts to divide. I heard updates through Robert, who maintained a relationship with our son that didn't require him to take sides in our estrangement. The process was financially devastating for Michael, just as he'd predicted, but he found ways to manage without my assistance. He sold his expensive Manhattan apartment and moved to a more modest place in Queens, ironically not far from where Robert and I lived. He took on additional consulting work to pay for legal fees. He borrowed money from friends and colleagues when credit cards weren't enough. He did all the things adults do when they face financial crises and don't have family members willing to absorb the consequences of their poor decisions. And slowly, gradually, he began to reach out in ways that weren't requests for help. A text message on my birthday, not asking for anything, just acknowledging the date. A phone call to check on my health when I had a minor medical procedure. Small gestures that suggested he was thinking about me as a person rather than as a resource. I didn't immediately reciprocate or rush to rebuild intimacy. Trust, I'd learned, needed to be earned back slowly after being broken so completely. But I noticed these efforts and appreciated them, even if I wasn't ready to fully engage with them yet. The real test came on Mother's Day, nearly a year after the wedding that had blown our relationship apart. I wasn't expecting anything. Michael had missed the previous 2 Mother's Days without acknowledgement. So I was surprised to find him at my door that Sunday morning with a small bouquet of flowers and an uncomfortable expression. "Do you have a few minutes to talk?" he asked. I invited him in and made tea, noting how nervous he seemed. This wasn't the confident, demanding person who'd asked for money during his divorce crisis. This was someone who looked genuinely uncertain about his welcome in my home. "I've been thinking a lot," he began once we were seated at my kitchen table, "about everything that happened. About the wedding, about how we treated you, about the way I've taken you for granted over the years." I waited, not rushing to reassure him or make the conversation easier for him to navigate. "You were right," he said finally, "about all of it. The way we planned that wedding, the way we excluded you, the way we discussed you like you were a problem to be solved instead of a person to be honored. It was cruel. It was wrong, and I'm sorry." This apology was different from his previous attempts. It was specific rather than general, focused on his actions rather than my reactions. He appeared to feel about the harm he'd caused rather than frustrated by my response to being harmed. "I think," he continued, "I got so caught up in trying to build a new life with Stephanie that I forgot to value the relationships I already had. I thought that meant they were less important, that they required less care and attention. I thought you'd always be there no matter how I treated you. So I stopped treating you with the respect you deserved." The conversation continued for more than an hour, with Michael acknowledging specific incidents and patterns of behavior that had damaged our relationship. He didn't make excuses or try to minimize the impact of his choices. He didn't rush to move on from the difficult topics or pressure me to immediately forgive and forget. He sat with the discomfort of facing what he'd done and let me express how it had affected me without becoming defensive. When he finally asked about the possibility of rebuilding our relationship, it was with genuine humility rather than entitled expectation. "I know trust takes time to rebuild," he said. "I know I can't expect you to just forget everything that happened and go back to how things were. But I'd like the chance to show you that I can do better. Be better, if you're willing to let me try." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw not the entitled man-child who'd asked me to fund his wedding while excluding me from it, but someone who appeared to have learned something from the painful collapse of his marriage and the consequences of his choices. Someone who looked genuinely remorseful rather than just frustrated by the inconvenience of our estrangement. "I'm willing to try," I said carefully, "but things will be different between us. I won't go back to being the person who says yes to everything and asks for nothing in return. I won't pretend that boundaries are optional or that respect is negotiable. If you want a relationship with me, it will need to be an actual relationship between equals, not a service arrangement where I provide support and you provide occasional acknowledgement." He nodded seriously. "I understand. And I want that too. A real relationship, where I know you as a person, and not just as someone who takes care of things for me." The rebuilding process was slow and sometimes frustrating, but genuine. Michael called regularly just to talk, without needing anything from me. He asked about my interests, my health, my opinions on current events. He invited me to dinner at restaurants where we could have actual conversations, rather than family gatherings where I was expected to serve and clean up. Most importantly, he began to demonstrate that he valued my presence rather than just my resources. When I mentioned my interest in art classes, he didn't dismiss it as a silly hobby for seniors. He asked questions about what I was learning, looked at pictures of my paintings, Even attended a student art show where my work was displayed. When I told him about my volunteer work at the soup kitchen, he didn't suggest it was too much work for someone my age or worry about my safety in an urban community service setting. Instead, he asked if they needed additional volunteers and showed up the following weekend to help serve meals alongside me. These might seem like small gestures to some people, but to me, they were revolutionary. For the first time in decades, my son was treating me like a whole person with interests and abilities and contributions that extended beyond my usefulness to his life. He was getting to know the woman I was becoming, rather than trying to reshape me back into the woman I'd been. The relationship between Robert and me also continued to evolve. With Michael requiring less of my emotional energy and attention, I had space to rediscover who I was as a wife rather than just as a mother and service provider. Robert and I began doing things together that we both enjoyed, taking walks along the East River, playing cards with other couples in our building, even planning our first vacation together in more than 15 years. We attended counseling sessions with a therapist who specialized in long-term marriage challenges, working through decades of patterns that no longer served us. Robert acknowledged his role in my gradual disappearance, the ways he'd passively allowed our son to treat me as disposable while he focused on his own relationship with Michael. Together, we built new ways of communicating that honored both of our needs and perspectives. The most surprising development in this season of rebuilding was the friendship that deepened between Mrs. Alvarez and me. What had started as neighborly concern during my family crisis blossomed into genuine companionship. We took cooking classes together, exploring cuisines neither of us had attempted before. We joined a book club at the local library, reading authors who challenged our perspectives and sparked passionate discussions. We traveled together to visit her family in Puerto Rico, where I was welcomed warmly as her dear friend from New York. Elena, she'd insisted I call her by her first name once our friendship solidified, became the sister I'd never had. The friend I'd never allowed myself to cultivate during the years when family obligations consumed all my time and energy. With her, I could be entirely myself without having to manage anyone else's emotions or needs. Our friendship was reciprocal in a way my family relationships had never been, each of us giving and receiving support naturally and generously. As my 73rd birthday approached, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary year I'd lived. 12 months earlier, I'd been a woman whose primary identity was serving other people's needs, whose days were structured around other people's schedules, whose happiness was entirely dependent on other people's approval. I'd been financially supporting adults who treated me like hired help, emotionally managing conflicts I hadn't created, and accepting crumbs of attention from people who claimed to love me, but couldn't be bothered to include me in their celebrations. Now I was a woman with her own interests, her own friendships, her own financial security, and her own standards for how she deserved to be treated. I was still a mother and a wife, but those roles no longer consumed my entire identity. I was also an artist, a volunteer, a friend, a traveler, a student, all the things I'd forgotten I could be when I wasn't constantly serving other people's needs. My birthday celebration reflected this transformation. Instead of waiting to see if anyone would remember or acknowledge the date, I planned my own party. I invited Elena and her daughter, the other volunteers from the soup kitchen, my art class friends, and neighbors from our building who'd become genuine friends over the past year. Robert helped me prepare food, and Michael arrived with flowers and a painting easel he'd bought after I mentioned wanting a better setup for my artwork at home. It was a small gathering, maybe 15 people total, but it was filled with people who genuinely enjoyed my company and wanted to celebrate my life. The conversation was lively, the laughter was genuine, and I felt surrounded by love that wasn't conditional on my usefulness or availability. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and Robert had gone to bed, Michael lingered to help clean up. We worked together in comfortable silence, something that would have been impossible during the years of tension and unspoken resentments. "Thank you," he said as we finished drying the last of the dishes. "For what?" "For not giving up on me completely. For being willing to let me try to do better. For showing me what it looks like to have boundaries and stick to them even when it's difficult." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I think seeing you stand up for yourself taught me something about self-respect that I needed to learn. Not just in terms of how I treat other people, but in terms of what I accept in my own life. This conversation led to a deeper discussion about his marriage and divorce, the ways Stephanie's treatment of him had mirrored his treatment of me, his gradual realization that relationships based on utility and convenience rather than genuine respect and affection were unsustainable. He'd learned something valuable from the painful collapse of his marriage, lessons about reciprocity and appreciation that he was now applying to all his relationships, including ours. "I don't want to ever take you for granted again," he said as he prepared to leave. "Not just because I love you. I always loved you, even when I wasn't showing it well, but because you're an interesting, capable, worthwhile person who adds value to my life in ways that have nothing to do with what you can do for me." After he left, I sat in my cleaned-up apartment, surrounded by birthday cards and flowers and the lingering warmth of an evening spent with people who truly cared about me. I thought about the journey I'd taken over the past year, from the woman who'd been excluded from her own son's wedding to the woman who'd just celebrated her birthday with friends who valued her presence. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. There had been moments of doubt, nights of loneliness, times when I'd wondered if standing up for myself was worth the cost of estrangement from my son. But sitting in my peaceful home, financially secure, emotionally supported, surrounded by evidence of a life that belonged entirely to me, I knew I'd made the right choice. 6 months later, I received an invitation that completed the circle of my transformation. Michael was remarrying, this time to a woman named Sarah who worked as a social worker and shared his interest in community service. The relationship had developed slowly over several months, built on friendship and shared values rather than financial status and social positioning. The wedding invitation was addressed specifically to me, with a handwritten note from Michael. "Mom, Sarah, and I would be honored to have you stand with us as we make this commitment to each other. Your presence would make this day complete." There was also a note from Sarah herself, introducing herself properly, and expressing her hopes that we might build a genuine relationship based on mutual respect and affection. This wedding was different in every way from the extravagant affair I'd been excluded from. It was smaller, held in a community center rather than an exclusive venue, focused on the celebration of commitment rather than the display of wealth and status. The guest list included the people who actually mattered to Michael and Sarah's lives, family members who'd supported them, friends who'd helped them grow as individuals and as a couple, colleagues who'd become genuine companions. I attended wearing a dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, not because it was expected of me, but because I wanted to honor the significance of the day. I sat in the front row as the mother of the groom, not relegated to a back table or excluded entirely. When Michael and Sarah exchanged vows that spoke about partnership and respect and building a life together based on shared values, I felt genuinely happy for them. During the reception, Sarah made a point of spending time with me, asking about my art and my volunteer work and my friendship with Elena. She listened with genuine interest to my stories about Puerto Rico and my painting classes and the book club's heated discussions about contemporary fiction. She treated me like someone worth knowing rather than someone to be managed or tolerated. "Thank you for raising such a thoughtful man," she said at some point during the evening. "I know he's had to learn some lessons the hard way, but he talks about you with such admiration now. He tells me you taught him about standing up for his principles even when it's difficult." The irony made me smile. I had indeed taught Michael about standing up for his principles, but not in the way I'd originally intended. I'd taught him by standing up for mine, by refusing to accept treatment that diminished my dignity, by insisting on relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided service. As the evening wound down, Michael asked me to dance, something we hadn't done since his high school graduation. Moving slowly around the dance floor, surrounded by people celebrating love and commitment and new beginnings, I felt the final pieces of healing fall into place. "I love you, Mom," he said as the song ended. "Not for what you've done for me over the years, not for the ways you've supported me through difficult times, but for who you are, for your strength and your creativity, and your compassion and your refusal to let anyone treat you as less than you deserve." Looking back now, almost 2 years after that first devastating text message that excluded me from my son's wedding, I can see the gift that crisis gave me. It forced me to confront the ways I'd disappeared myself in service of other people's comfort, the ways I'd accepted crumbs of affection while calling it love, the ways I'd avoided conflict at the cost of my own dignity and self-respect. The woman I am now, sitting in my sun-filled apartment, surrounded by my own art and books and mementos from travels with Elena, planning dinner with Robert and looking forward to next week's volunteer shift at the soup kitchen. She's someone I barely recognized 2 years ago. She's someone who knows her own worth and insists that others recognize it too. She's someone who gives generously but not desperately, who loves deeply but not self-destructively, who serves others but not at the expense of her own well-being. I still face challenges, of course. Robert's memory issues are becoming more pronounced, requiring adjustments and patience and difficult conversations about our future. Michael's marriage is strong and healthy, but we're still learning how to maintain our improved relationship through the ordinary stresses of adult life. Elena's health isn't perfect, and I sometimes worry about losing this friendship that has become so precious to me. But these challenges feel manageable in ways that my old life never did, because I face them from a position of strength rather than depletion. I have resources, emotional, financial, social, that I've carefully built and protected. I have relationships that sustain me rather than drain me. I have a sense of purpose that extends beyond meeting other people's needs. Most importantly, I have boundaries that protect my peace and relationships that honor my dignity. I no longer accept treatment that diminishes me or relationships that require me to disappear myself. I no longer confuse service with self-sacrifice or love with self-destruction. As I prepare to celebrate my 74th birthday next month, I find myself looking forward to the future with excitement rather than resignation. There are art workshops I want to attend, hiking trails Elena wants to show me, volunteer opportunities that could use my skills and experience. There are conversations with Robert about our shared dreams for retirement, plans with Michael and Sarah for holiday celebrations that will include, rather than exclude, the people who matter. There are possibilities ahead that I couldn't have imagined when I was the woman who rose before dawn to iron other people's shirts, who swallowed her disappointment and called it love, who disappeared herself so completely that her own family forgot she deserved basic respect and inclusion. The transformation wasn't easy and it wasn't quick, but it was necessary. Sometimes love requires standing up to the people we love most, refusing to accept treatment that diminishes us, insisting on relationships that honor our full humanity. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to enable other people's thoughtlessness, selfishness, or cruelty. Sometimes liberation comes wrapped in pain, but it's still liberation. Sometimes the people who claim to love us need to lose access to us before they can learn to value our presence. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give our children is teaching them, through our example, what it means to insist on being treated with dignity and respect. I hold a glass of red wine by my window now, watching the Manhattan skyline glow like an old promise kept, and I know that every difficult choice I made was worth it. The chain of people-pleasing that had bound me for decades is broken. The voice that had been silenced by years of putting everyone else first has found its strength. The woman who had disappeared into service and sacrifice has been reborn into purpose and joy. No chain is unbreakable when you find the courage to examine its links. No voice is unworthy when you summon the strength to use it. No life is over while there's still breath to dream new dreams and set new boundaries and demand new respect. Sometimes liberation comes wrapped in pain, but liberation nonetheless. And sometimes the most important question isn't whether we'll be forgiven for demanding better treatment, but whether we can forgive ourselves for accepting less than we deserved for so long. Have you ever lived or known someone who lived something like this? Have you ever found yourself disappearing into relationships that demanded everything and gave nothing in return? Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity? Please share your story in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, if you recognized pieces of your own journey in mine, I ask you to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps me continue sharing these stories, continue opening my heart to connect with others who might need to hear that they're not alone in their struggles, that transformation is possible at any age, that it's never too late to demand the respect and love we've always deserved. Together we heal. Together we rise. Together we remember that we are worthy of love that doesn't require us to disappear.